Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Production and Supply Regulations in Legal Cannabis Markets. My name is Reese Cohen, and I'm the Global Partnerships and Engagement Advisor at Penington Institute. We are a not-for-profit organization that's focused on supporting cost-effective approaches that maximize community health and safety in relation to drugs, including pharmaceuticals and alcohol. Today, I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands from which we are all speaking from today. This is the third webinar in a series titled Global Perspectives on Australia's Cannabis Future, where we ask leading experts to share their cannabis policy insights from Australia and around the globe, as we explore the big questions that need to be answered about how Australia could legalise and regulate the recreational use of cannabis. If you haven't seen the previous webinars in this series, I encourage you to check them out. We have tackled issues of physical and mental health in episode 1, and public safety and amenity considerations such as sort of road safety and public consumption in webinar 2. And all of the webinars are available on the Penington Institute website. If you just go to the news and events page, you'll be able to find them. Today's webinar will run for about an hour and consist of a facilitated panel conversation for about 45 minutes, followed by time for audience Q&A. And I really encourage you all to use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout today's discussion. And we'll save all of those up and we'll get to them, as many of them as we can at the end. The session will be recorded and you will be able to view it on our website afterwards. And our topic today, once again, is production and supply. So we're going to be talking about issues like how to implement both commercial and non-commercial models of cannabis production, the role of government enterprises, and personal cultivation or home grow. And I'm really excited to bring you our 3 expert panelists who will briefly introduce themselves, and then we can get stuck into it. So in no particular order, please welcome Katja Kowalski. Katja, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, please?
Yeah, really nice to be here. My name is Katja Kowalski. I'm head of operations at VoltFAS, and VoltFAS is an advocacy and communications organization that specializes in drug policy. Our focus as an organization is to reduce drug-related harm, and the vast majority of our work over the last couple of years is focused on cannabis, both recreational and medical, and we're UK-based.
Wonderful. Thanks, Katja. And also with us is Steve Rolls. Steve, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Steve Rolls. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which is a drug policy and advocacy group also based in the UK. We're a registered charity. We've been in the field of drug policy and law reform for about 25 years now. The focus of our work has very much been in trying to provide a coherent vision of what a post-prohibition world looks like. So how do we regulate drugs, all drugs, including cannabis, but all drugs as well, other drugs as well, after the war on drugs is over and in a post-prohibition world? And to that end, we've produced a range of detailed proposals, regulatory frameworks for cannabis and other drugs. And we've worked with the media, with public institutions, with civil society, and increasingly in a consultancy role with governments around the world in trying to develop and implement just and effective policies, drug policies, including decriminalization and legal regulation of drugs.
Fantastic. Thank you. And last but not least, we have Alfredo Pascual. Alfredo, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you for having me here as part of this panel. I am Executive Director at Seed Innovations. That's an investment company with several cannabis-related investments. Before, I used to work as international analyst at MJBiz Daily, a leading publication in the industry. And although I've been working in the cannabis industry for several years, my passion remains public policy. I have a master's degree in public policy from the University of Passau in Germany. And perhaps it's also worth mentioning that I am speaking here in my personal capacity. So the company that I work for has some investments in strictly medical cannabis companies, but no exposure to recreational cannabis and no intention whatsoever of having it in the foreseeable future. So my views here are just my personal views.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it, taking the time out of your days. Okay, so to kick us off, I thought it might be useful to start by unpacking some of the terms that we're going to be using a lot in today's webinar. Like, what do we mean when we say production and supply in regulated cannabis markets? Steve, maybe you want to jump in on this one to start us off.
Right. What I think a useful way to think about the cannabis supply chain is really just to think about how we have a supply chain for anything. And it seems like a stupid and obvious thing to say. But in the strange world of drug policy, seemingly obvious things don't often feature in the drug policy debate. Like, having sensible set of goals for your policy related to a set of measures and indicators. That would seem normal in most policy arenas, but in the strange world of illegal drug policy, we're often driven more by very binary good and evil kind of narratives, and the idea of just normal drug policy, normal social policy thinking is an anathema. So I think with something like the supply chain, you have producers who are licensed to produce certain products. You then have transit. You have regulation of supply and vendors, and then you have access to and use of consumers. And at each of those stages, you will have a series of regulatory questions, and we're very familiar with that when it comes to alcohol and tobacco. So you have licensed production, licensed products, licensed vendors, and controlled access. But with cannabis, when something's just prohibited, then none of those things are engaged with at all, and we effectively default the decision-making process to the whims of an illegal market that's regulated by, well, it's unregulated effectively, because the control has been abdicated to organized crime groups and unregulated dealers. So that, production and supply, there's just a set of questions that we apply to all other products, and we need to workshop what that would look like for cannabis to help deliver the kinds of outcomes on our shared goals in terms of public health, in terms of economic activity, in terms of individual and corporate freedoms, and in terms of crime reduction and protection of vulnerable populations. So I don't think there's any particular mystery there. It's just using the regulatory logic that we apply to everything else and applying it to this particular product or set of products that, for various weird historical reasons, has sat outside of that regulatory logic historically.
Thank you for that. And it sounds quite straightforward, and of course it is. But then there are all of these, hang-ups, as you mentioned, about maybe why cannabis and other drugs aren't thought of intuitively like we think of other goods in a production and supply chain. And assuming Australia adopts a model which is explicitly prioritizing public health, which seems likely and tends to be the way these things go. What are the most important considerations for that policy objective when it comes to questions of designing production and supply regulations? Alfredo or Katja, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in, and Alfredo, you can butt in at any point and follow up from my points. I guess as a kind of a starting point, as a side note, I'd say that it's important that a model doesn't solely prioritize public health, and in order to be effective in reducing harms and eliminating the illicit market initially, I think solely focusing on public health has some potential pitfalls. I think when it comes to legalizing cannabis, I don't think there's any point in doing it unless you can bring people over from the illicit market. And the kind of initial goal should always be to move as many consumers over to the legal market initially. As we've seen with Canada legalizing, I think only up until recently have they kind of captured over 50% of the illicit market. And I think then kind of once that's accomplished to a certain degree, then you can start putting through harm reduction interventions, education, and changes to the legal market over time to bring in public health messages. But I think from a production perspective, there's a number of things that are really important initially, such as considerations around THC content, ensuring that, well, one, it's not too high to, cause public health outcry, but also not too low, meaning that no consumers will kind of move over. You need to consider how good quality the cannabis is around the kind of smell and the taste, and ensuring that people enjoy it recreationally so that it's able to outperform the illicit market initially. And then you've got things like regulation and licensing, as in order for cannabis to be produced, so it needs to be produced and sold quickly to the consumer in order to defeat the illicit market, as if it's kind of related, kind of not related. But in the UK, the medical market is struggling because a lot of patients are legacy users, and the time and the time that it takes for medicine to be delivered to patients is considerably longer than the illicit market. And I guess when it comes to a recreational market, that's an important consideration. And then there's things like supply and making sure that you don't create too much cannabis initially and then you're not able to kind of sell it, as that's kind of what happened in Canada. So yeah, I think there's an important consideration around public health, but also kind of thinking about consumer demand and preferences, and making sure that there is a public health aspect to a cannabis model, but it's not the kind of sole approach. As I think that models that are being implemented or proposed in Germany and across Europe, there's, I think, a strong kind of element of historic stigma when it comes to cannabis use. And there's this desire to kind of box off cannabis and make sure that it doesn't become too mainstream and that not too many people use it and all of this. And there's an overly cautious approach. And I feel like that is potentially detrimental to the kind of effectiveness of a legal market.
Thank you. Super interesting. Alfredo, anything to add there?
Yeah, so Katia, you stole my words a little bit. But even if public health is the priority, I think a key measure of success of that would be the extent and the speed to which in which the illicit market is substituted by a legal supply. Because as Steve correctly said in his introduction, there's little to no concern for public health in the illicit market. And the empirical evidence that I know suggests that the objective of replacing that illicit market with legal sales best occurs when markets are designed in a way with which my good industry friend Pablo Swanik calls the 3 A's: access, affordability, and assortment. So access in the sense of having plenty of stores, maybe including online sales, no hassles. I remember one of the initial German proposals in which when Germany was still trying to get a legal market. Now it's not the case anymore, but at that time, one of the proposals was to have only retail stores, physical stores, so that people that wanted to buy would go there and get a government sermon about the dangers of cannabis, right? And it sounds very nice in terms of harm reduction, but it's just out of touch with reality, right? So that's about access. Affordability, of course, means having competitive prices, not having taxes that cripple the industry and increases prices above the illicit market. And then assortment means having the products that consumers want and not the products that regulators wish that consumers would want, including, for instance, not having THC limits. And in terms of examples, I always hate comparisons, but I think it's unavoidable to make some comparisons because the evidence that we have so far is quite limited, even if we have several instances of cannabis legalization or quasi-legalization in different parts of the world. But I remember very well about 10 years ago, my home country, Uruguay, legalizing at about the same time that in the US, Colorado, Washington, and a little bit later, Oregon were legalizing with very different models. And there are pros and cons of these models. There's no perfect model, I think. But I think one thing is unavoidable to mention, and it is that 10 years later, in those US states, the internal sales are mostly legal, while in Uruguay, with a much more restrictive model and a crippled market, basically, in terms of commercial sales, a huge so-called gray market has developed in which the market is being illegally supplied to a certain extent, at least by home growers and clubs that are operating outside the strict legal framework. And even within the US, you see states like California that have really high taxes, convoluted regulations, local retailing restrictions with places of California that are like deserts where cannabis cannot be sold. And these markets tend to have a larger share of it being supplied by illicit operators. And then in terms of the question of whether public health should be the sole priority, as I'm with Katya here, I don't think it should be the sole priority. I think it should be one of the considerations. Other considerations could include justice, for example. As my good friend from Uruguay, Daniel Radillo, he's the Secretary General of the National Drugs Board there. He says cannabis should be mainly legalized to protect people's right to decide to consume. As easy as that. And that includes as a justice, personal autonomy argument, you could say, that unfortunately is largely missing, particularly in Europe, where most of the focus around legalization is around state control, mitigating the perceived harms of cannabis use, and little consideration is given to the fact that it's actually the war on drugs and failed policies that have caused much more significant societal harm than cannabis use itself. So yeah, all these state-centered, overly regulated partial legalization models can have all the rules that they want and pretend the state is still controlling cannabis users. But at the end of the day, it's an illusion if the illicit market is the one that continues prevailing.
Thank you. Really great contributions. Appreciate it. Any other points to touch on there, Steve? Or
Can I chip in? It's really interesting to hear what Katya and Alfredo were saying, and I don't have any significant disagreements with it. I think it's an issue for me of balance, because clearly there are different stakeholders in the discussions around cannabis policy and cannabis regulation, and there are a set of different priorities and outcomes, and different stakeholders will have different priorities. So the public health actors will understandably prioritize public health. People in enforcement and crime reduction will understandably prioritize that. Parent groups and children's groups will prioritize children's welfare. The Treasury and government may prioritize tax revenue and economic activity. And people in social justice may prioritize, personal autonomy, social justice issues, racial justice, reparations, and so on. And I don't think any person has a monopoly, or I don't think we want to get into a sort of bidding war about which of those stakeholders or priorities is the best or the most important. They're all important, and we have to between ourselves democratically decide how we balance those, because sometimes, not always, generally I think a move towards regulation supports all of those goals. But certain types of policy or certain types of regulatory design will tend to support perhaps one of those priorities over another, and occasionally they can be in conflict. And it's both Katya and Alfredo have already mentioned that there can be a trade-off, for example, between a goal of trying to get rid of the illegal market and perhaps goals of public health or concerns around public health and more interventionist regulation. And you see that perhaps most obviously with tobacco policy and tobacco taxation pricing. The public health people are saying, look, if you put tobacco prices up, you dissuade use. And that is true. That the evidence shows that very clearly. As tobacco prices go up, smoking levels go down because it becomes less affordable. But on the other hand, as tobacco prices up, you also incentivize smuggling and counterfeiting. So you have a bigger parallel illegal market for tobacco. Like in the UK, we have incredibly high tobacco. A pack of cigarettes is like £12 or sort of $15 in the UK. But we also have about 20% of the market is either smuggled or counterfeit tobacco. And you could reduce that to zero. In Andorra, where in Europe, where there's no tobacco tax at all and cigarettes are a couple of dollars a packet, there's no smuggling at all. There's loads of smuggling out of Andorra, but there's no smuggling into it, because why would you? There's no incentive. So these are the kind of delicate balancing acts that we need to do as policy makers and designers. And I don't think there's right answer. You move into a sort of political space about what is your priority. We obviously have to look at evidence of what's working and what delivers. And I agree with Alfredo that you could argue that some markets are perhaps not regulated enough and have perhaps been over commercialized. Other ones have been over-regulated, and I would include Uruguay in that. I agree that the retail market in Uruguay is too tightly controlled and too tightly regulated. I'd have to take some blame for that, because I was involved in designing that model back in 2011. But like, you know, the fact you have to register to buy cannabis, and you can only buy two or three types of cannabis, and you have to buy it from a very small number of pharmacies in Uruguay. In terms of the retail model, it's too restrictive, and I think that the Uruguay model, it was well intentioned when it started, but it needs to evolve. But I think that's another thing you can do. Another thing you can do with regulatory policy is look at the evidence, and you can grow and change. But again, it depends on what your priorities are, how the policy will end up looking.
Actually, Alfredo, I can see you wanting to jump in, but I will gently actually move us on if that's okay, and if we can get back to that point at a later date. Apologies, but because we've been talking at a very conceptual level about principles and objectives and priorities and trade-offs, which I find that super interesting. But one of the things that I want to get back to is different models of production and supply in regulated cannabis markets, and how they might be used to achieve whatever objectives we happen to be pursuing. One of the issues we've touched on so far has been, the extent to which markets are commercially available and attractive or not. And one of the levers, or one of the policy options that are available to regulators, is whether to allow people to grow their own cannabis at home, and thereby, in theory, not need to engage in a commercial market and perhaps avoid some of the challenges that might come with that. Most jurisdictions with legalized home cultivation have certain parameters around what's permitted. Maybe it's how many plants or what kinds of plants, or we're talking about Uruguay, the specific cultivars perhaps that could be cultivated, and THC limits and whatnot. Do any of you have a preference or a recommendation for, I guess, to begin with, whether home cultivation should be a part of any regulated cannabis market, and B, what are your preferred regulatory settings for home grow within regulated markets? Alfredo, since I cut you off, why don't you jump in on that one?
Yeah. So I do have a strong opinion on home growing, and I'll go to it right away. I just wanted to continue with what Steve was saying, that I would say it's important to say that no matter the disagreements, I think we are all well-intended here, right? And yeah, we might have different backgrounds and different opinions on how it should be done, but it's not like somebody's trying to design a policy that it's ill-intended. Mm-hmm. And in terms of home growing, I mean, of course, it should be allowed. It exists no matter what. I mean, we can pretend that it doesn't exist and turn a blind eye, but it will continue to exist whether there's a market or not. And I would say, I agree with Steve, there's no perfect recipe here of how it should be done. There are different approaches, but my big point here is that it shouldn't be regulated in a way that it cannot be controlled. It's just silly to have 1,000 rules for home growers when those rules then will not be enforced. And for example, in Germany, right now, the discussion at this moment is to allow to grow 3 plants at home, yet only allow possession of your homegrown cannabis of up to 60 grams. That means you could have 3 plants at home, but you could never harvest more than 60 grams. How is that possible? I mean, where do they come up with these numbers? I mean, have they ever grown a cannabis plant, those that figure out these numbers? It's just nonsense. It's out of touch with reality. And I would say it's being drafted by people who want to perhaps appeal to the more conservative voters by saying, look, we are doing very strict regulations here. We are not going to allow anyone to harvest more than 60 grams at home. And it looks nice on paper, but it's not going to be the reality, because if you have 3 plants at home, unless you're a terrible grower, you're going to harvest more than 60 grams. And yeah, so those arbitrary limits on the number of plants, the number of grams are generally not based on pragmatism, and are mostly based on trying to appear that you are being strict with the regulations and appeal to that voter base. Another silly thing that is being proposed in Germany is that you wouldn't be able to share your homegrown cannabis with friends at home, for example. I mean, how silly is that? Do we really expect that people won't be sharing their homegrown cannabis at home with their friends? It's just, again, out of touch with reality. And it's impossible to enforce. And I often hear people downplay this rule because they say, well, but this is not going to be enforced anyway, so why do you care? And I do care anyway, because rich kids may not care about this because they know that they probably won't be controlled by law enforcement. But in more marginalized communities, having these arbitrary laws remains a big problem. So yeah, I would say I don't have a magical number of plants or a magical number of grams. I would say simply don't have rules that then cannot be enforced.
Really good points. Thank you. Katja, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I echo Alfredo's points. I think from like a number of plants amount that can be cultivated, I don't really have a preference, and I don't really know what the magical number is. I feel like I don't have enough expertise in this area, but I would agree. I think things that just look good on paper but can't be enforced practically are going to fail. So I think just something that something that seems sensible. But yeah, on homegrown more generally, yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a absolutely crucial and essential part to any kind of cannabis legalization policy. I think it would be ludicrous to legalize cannabis and not allow people to grow their own. But I would say that grow your own as a kind of a policy overall practically probably isn't for everyone, because of the amount of time and energy and space it takes to grow cannabis. It feels, I'm looking at like my apartment in London, I would be able to cultivate cannabis in here. So I think there's a lot of considerations around that working for some people, but not for others. And I think it really appeals to a very small cohort of people that have a lot of knowledge and expertise and enjoyment out of the cannabis plant. But to the average person that maybe wants to buy a bit of cannabis when it's legal, I don't think that works for them. So I think there's a lot of considerations around the kind of the practicality of it. But yeah, as a policy, it should definitely be included in any kind of recreational legalization.
Thanks. That makes sense. And I guess that, that point about certain people not having access or interest in or capability to cultivate cannabis at home is partly why we've seen other ways of organizing cultivation and production in a non-commercial way, which when you sort of get into an organized model turns into like a cannabis social club, which is something that we're discussing a lot, increasingly discussing in Australia. Steve, maybe you can jump in on this. Like, what's the like? What are cannabis social clubs?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Alfredo and Katia said on that. Obviously you have to have home growing as part of the system, but I don't think it works on its own. I don't think. I think you need to, in terms of a regulatory response to home growing. I agree with Alfredo. There's no point having silly controls that can't be enforced, and things that happen in the privacy of someone's home are intrinsically very difficult to enforce. I think you can only really have a reactive enforcement model. I don't agree with having a licensing of home growing. I think you can have some rules or guidelines on the amounts that someone can produce, but the amount that someone produces isn't really the issue. The issue would be if people are reselling it for profit outside of a regulated market, at which point I think you can then have some rules and enforcement or sanctions. But generally speaking, I would agree. I think that, and I agree with you, Alfredo, that having like, and in Malta, for example, it's 50 grams you can possess at home. And they're talking about 60 grams. And if you are home growing, you will produce much more than that. It is inconsistent and silly. And so the law in both of those cases needs to evolve. And then, in Malta, that conversation is happening. People are already saying, well, actually, this doesn't make sense to have a 50-gram limit and allow 4 plants to grow, because those two things simply aren't compatible with each other. So for me, it's about homegrown being part of the system. But as you say, Reese, and I guess that's something we're going to move on to, a home growing system can be part of a quasi-formal or potentially actually formal social club sharing model as well. So I think the two kind of blur into each other.
They do seem to sort of naturally fit, right? Yeah.
Where home growing's happened, it really hasn't been significantly problematic anywhere. I mean, there has been some issues with reselling in some places, but it generally reflects a wider context of poor access to legal cannabis outside of the home growing. Home growing's been tolerated in the Netherlands, but it's never particularly been an issue anyway, because people could just go to coffee shops.
Yeah. Just very quickly, for people in the audience who might not know what a cannabis social club is, we're talking about people who band together in a non-commercial way to cultivate cannabis on behalf of each other and access it like they would a sort of a club of some kind. But Are there any like downsides, or like what are the oppositions, or what are the criticisms that people tend to have of cannabis social clubs as a way to cultivate and produce cannabis? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I guess one of the kind of regulatory hurdles is that it can create a gray market quite quickly. And there's not always loads of control and oversight into how it's regulated. I'm not an expert in social clubs at all, but I know that there's kind of a gray market that's emerged in like Barcelona and Spain around social clubs. And I guess from just kind of an analyst point of view as well, I think that social clubs don't do a great job at kind of normalizing cannabis in the plant and making kind of a new consumer. I feel like social clubs do still feel quite niche. So yeah, I think from like a normalization and breaking down stigma, I don't know how effective social clubs are in that regard, but yeah, those are kind of all my comments.
Thanks for that.
I mean, I would come back to the issue of balance. I think that the problem with the social clubs in Spain is that they're not regulated. I mean, they are regulated, but only informally. There's not a regulatory body. There's no sort of enforcement of regulations. They're not technically legal outside of a sort of a case law established by a series of iterative court cases within a decriminalization framework. They're not technically legal and regulated as they are, for example, in Uruguay or Malta. And so you, on the one hand, you have a lack of regulation is a problem in Spain, whereas in Uruguay, I think they're perhaps too regulated. Or over-regulated, and so you have a lot of the clubs are operating outside of the regulatory framework. But Alfredo, I'm sure, can speak about that.
Yeah, so I think we all agree that there's no single solution in the terms of only home growing, only cannabis clubs, or only a commercial system, and it's a balance between the three pathways. And if somebody has a fourth proposal, then probably welcome. I think that the problems arise when you only limit the legal supply to one or two of these pathways, or when you, in theory, allow the three of them, like in Uruguay, for example, with homegrown cannabis clubs and a commercial retail system, but then you basically cripple one of the pathways. And we will know more later, probably this year or probably next year, with some studies that are being done in Uruguay about the so-called gray market. There's a really good researcher there called Rosario Queirolo who is studying this very deeply. And I think it all hints to the fact that because the retail cannabis in Uruguay is extremely limited, there's a significant diversion from the homegrown and particularly clubs grown cannabis to illicit sales, right? So clubs are supposed to grow only for their members. In Uruguay, they are very limited in terms of the number of members, with only 45 maximum members, which creates a problem of scale. Some of them complain that with that scale, it's really hard to produce in an affordable way. And perhaps the vast majority of them comply strictly with the regulations. But as Katia was saying, it's really hard to you cannot have the police on the door of every club controlling that they are doing things properly, right? And when you cannot have a policeman on every house and every club, there's going to be a risk of diversion into the illicit market. And I think that the risk of diversion into the illicit market is heightened when you don't have a commercial system that is also functioning properly, which I think it's the case. It's my hypothesis of what is happening in Uruguay, or what has been happening in Uruguay the past few years, that this diversion is fueled by the fact that there are vast areas of the country in Uruguay where you cannot buy cannabis at retail because there's simply no location where you can do it. And then, as Tips mentioned before, even if you can buy, it's very limited in terms of the number of products, with just about 3 strains, I think it is now. They increased the THC level of one of them to up to 15%, I think it is now, but it's still quite limited. So it's a very restrictive commercial model. And I think that's the reason why there's an incentive, you could say, to divert cannabis from legal clubs to the illicit market, even if they are regulated, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
Oh, sorry, Alfredo.
No, and just one more thing that I think applies to clubs as well as to homegrown. Like, don't create rules that then you cannot enforce, and again, don't make life miserable. I mean, don't expect the impossible from clubs. I think it's a great thing to have clubs as part of the model, let's say, but don't ask the impossible from clubs. And then if that fails, say, oh, your legalization failed. You see, right? Because in Germany right now, all the expectation is that the clubs will be the ones that will significantly reduce the illicit market. That's the expectation, the official expectation from government officials right now. We want to have cannabis clubs, no commercial model, cannabis clubs, because they will be the ones that will significantly reduce the illicit market, and home growing as well, of course. And as Katia was saying, it's still a niche thing. I mean, yes, they will reduce somewhat the illicit market, of course, but will they significantly reduce the illicit market? I don't know. And then if you then cripple them with regulations and requirements, then that's probably not going to work. Like in Germany right now, the proposal is to have like strict quality testing requirements for clubs, plain packaging, generate stability data for the shelf life of the product, and it's like all sorts of things that will make clubs uncompetitive with the illicit market. So yeah, you are expecting them to reduce the illicit market, but then you're cripple them with regulations. That's probably a recipe that will be challenging for the clubs.
I mean, like, so
yeah, I mean, I think
testing for regulated medicinal cannabis products in Australia isn't done particularly well at the moment in some places. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at Germany and Luxembourg. If you look at what they initially proposed, they were more ambitious sort of mixed economy models that included home growing, social clubs, and a commercial market, but they've been sort of restrained by the constraints of EU and UN law. So I think we can look at home growing and social clubs as useful elements of a model, but they of a future model that includes a commercial sales as well. But they're also probably in Europe, at least, they're more of they're significantly a transitional model. I don't think it's the end of the road. So Germany is sort of saying, right, phase 1 is going to be home growing and clubs, and phase 2 we will have a commercial market. So they're seeing it as a transitional thing, but it's significantly shaped by the international legal environment, as Uruguay was. I mean, the whole thing about licensing of registering of users and the pharmacy sales was because they were under a lot of pressure from Argentina and Brazil to prevent drug tourism, as they called it. I mean, I think it was a stupid, I don't believe it was going to ever be a big problem. But anyway, the legal constraints and the legal environment can shape the policy as well. So I don't think just a social club, I agree, I don't think social clubs and homegrown can ever finish the market, but they can be a transitional model towards a more mixed economy endpoint as well.
And
part of the solution.
Sorry, Alfredo, I'm going to cut you off. Sorry, because we are limited for time in this brief webinar. I love the conversation, everybody. No, thank you. I hate to cut you off. Again, I won't make a habit of it. But speaking of the commercial model, and by the way, for those listening at home, if you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function now, and we'll try to get to them before the end of the webinar. But speaking of a commercial model, which we've been sort of working our way up to, conceptually speaking, whether that involves maybe direct government ownership and control or participation in the market or not, when it comes to the commercial production and supply of cannabis, thinking about where Australia is at, politically speaking, in terms of our policy landscape, we're at a very, very early stage in having this conversation about what a regulated cannabis market could look like. What are the priorities or concerns, or I guess what's the guidance that you would give to Australian policymakers as they begin to embark on thinking about what a commercial model should look like? What do they need to consider?
Who are you asking?
Anyone who likes to answer.
But are you asking specifically about government monopolies and government companies, or what do you mean?
No, anything. I mean, whether that's involved or not is not a focus. I'm just asking in terms of a commercial model, whether that does involve government monopolies or not, or only commercial activities, or some combination thereof. Like, what are the concerns and considerations that you think policymakers should be paying attention to?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in, but I've been speaking a lot, so maybe someone else could say something.
Well, why are we even considering government monopolies, right? So probably because we consider cannabis to be a dangerous substance, and with dangerous substance, we want government monopolies to reduce over marketing the product, for example, and encouraging consumption and stuff like that. But I think we also need to consider the other side of it, and it is that particularly with cannabis, after decades of war against cannabis, do we want the same institutions, the same bureaucratic apparatus of the state being the one that is going to be the centerpiece in the supply chain of that market? And if we want that, then we need to be ready for certain disadvantages of that, which could be the usual disadvantages of government monopolies. Probably it's not that specific of cannabis. I guess this is a more broader conversation around the government monopolies in general, but you will have probably misallocation of resources, bureaucracy. I think here in the case of cannabis specifically, particularly potentially dangerous is political interference, because now you may have a government that is somewhat cannabis friendly and do want to promote a legal market with a government monopoly. But what happens with the change of government, for example? Will the government-owned store have to change its policy because of the new government and then operate in a different way that probably is not ideal for the goals of legalization? You will probably have lack of innovation. There's accountability issues, potential for corruption. I mean, the usual things for that are related to government monopolies. And in the case of Canada, which is probably the clearest example of government monopoly, it's a little bit complicated because it depends on the provinces. Basically, not in every province, but in most cases, what you do have is the government being the monopoly at the wholesale level. And you have things that are quite, at least to me, look quite unfair. For example, I'm a big fan of farm gate sales, so that producers can sell directly from the greenhouse to consumers, right? This probably encourages selling locally in the community, probably is beneficial for smaller producers that can sell locally. And in Canada, for example, what you do have, at least in Ontario, I don't know if it's in the whole Canada, I'm not an expert in the Canadian regulations, but I do know that the government wholesaler takes a big cut from farm gate sales, and they're not wholesaling anything, right? I mean, they're simply taking their cut from the farm sale gates, although they are not acting as a wholesaler there between the producer and the final retail store, because there's simply no final retail store. It's the producer directly that is selling, right? And then I was reading yesterday a story in MJB's Daily about regulatory chaos right now in Canada in terms of the distinction between an edible and an extract, right? So you have very strict limits when it comes to THC in edibles. So some are trying to pass edibles as extracts to have more THC in the products that consumers want. And you have government monopolies selling products that Health Canada considers non-compliant. So if you think that with a government monopoly you will solve the problems of a market that is too much focused on marketing, could be, but it will have its own disadvantages, right? It's always there's no perfect solution, I guess, is my main point here.
Yeah, I guess with I know with like the Canadian model as well, all the kind of commercial companies are really struggling, and the government's making an absolute bank out of cannabis regulation. But yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of limitations to a government-led model around, potentially the varieties of cannabis that are licensed and supplied, with predetermined THC and CBD levels. There's possibility to have limits on the kind of products that are sold as well. They're not being like edibles or oils or alternative products. And there being kind of strict limits on what people can buy as well. And I guess just like going back to that public health model point that we made at the beginning, I think that with any model that's implemented, it's really important that the kind of aspect of cannabis that's enjoyable, and the reason, that at the end of the day is the reason that people choose to use the drug. They enjoy it. It's enjoyable and brings the consumer a lot of pleasure.
And we shouldn't be afraid of saying that.
Yeah, and I think
unapologetic about
models. Yeah, I think with a lot of these models and with medical cannabis as well, we kind of try and stay clear and veer away from the fact that it's fun and it's enjoyable. And I think that's what that should be central to whatever model that's being proposed, and making sure that the consumer experience is at the center of that, and looking at how the consumer can best be served. And I think when we veer off too much into other areas, there's it kind of talks about how we reduce use and create fear and stigma with overregulation, and I think that's where a lot of these models will go wrong.
Great points, everybody. But there are probably like inherent risks to having commercial operators, or particular risks, I should say, to having commercial operators participate in production and supply. Not least of which is that they're not properly regulated in terms of how much they can produce. Canada at the moment is like 1.4 billion kilograms or billion grams of unsold inventory that's sitting in a safe somewhere. That's probably a bit of a risk.
They actually burnt 900 tons of cannabis in. They actually incinerated 900 tons of cannabis in Canada last year for overproduction. I do want to just defend public health here. I don't want because public health can, an intelligent public health approach would incorporate an analysis of pleasures and benefits from cannabis, and a public health approach would also include reducing the scale of a criminal market, because a criminal market is a public health harm in and of itself. Criminalization of individuals is a public health harm. So public health is a broader thing than just the nanny state saying you can only have 9% THC. It's a bit more sophisticated than that. And I'd like to defend the concept of public health. But there is certainly, looking at lessons from alcohol and tobacco, there are clearly lessons around the tension between commercial incentives and commercial profits and public health. If you have commercial entities whose goals are profit, that's not necessarily conducive to the public good, which includes public health. And we've seen that with alcohol and tobacco. And yes, I understand cannabis is not the same as alcohol and tobacco. It's certainly on most criteria less risky than both of those products. But there are dangers of monopolization, of market consolidation, of corporate capture, of undue influence on policy making by corporate powers that we have seen with big transnational alcohol and tobacco companies as well. But we can design market regulatory frameworks that allow for a diverse landscape of small and medium-sized businesses, and we don't have the kind of British American Tobacco, Molson, the Diageo type mega corporations that can march into countries and actually effectively dictate policy and corrupt the policy making process. So there's caution that's needed there in terms of preventing monopolies and corporate capture, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a vibrant commercial market where you can derive benefits from competition as well. It's just again, it comes back to balance. What is the balance between profit-making entities and their commercial freedoms and the needs of individuals and public health?
And on that point, there's a question that's come through from the audience. So if you have questions, please send them through now. We'll try and get through a couple before the end of the webinar that's on that topic, which is why I bring it up, which is in Australia at the moment, we have a federal bill that's been proposed by the Greens Party, which includes a restriction on companies from certain industries participating in a regulated cannabis market. And those industries are, alcohol, tobacco, and the pharmaceutical industry. Do you think an approach like that is desirable and or practical?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes? Oh, okay, interesting. Why so?
Well, because the alcohol and tobacco companies are just historically bad actors who have clearly prioritized profit over public health to the detriment and death of millions and millions of people. So they can just get the hell out and they're not welcome. It's pretty simple.
But
millions of people are dead.
I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but I mean, like how
no, I'm not. They are not welcome at the policymaking table, and they're not welcome in the market.
But are there challenges with at an operational level with excluding certain individuals or corporations or subsidiaries?
No, there's plenty of precedents for that, for excluding bad actors from markets. We do that in all kinds of things. It's not difficult at all.
Interesting.
I think it's a cat and mouse game, right? I mean, you can try to exclude them, but it's going to be challenging. And I agree with Steve. I don't want a handful of large multinational corporations dictating the policies of cannabis. I agree with the intention fully. I just don't know whether having policymakers being the ones picking winners and losers is the best approach for that. Because normally when you have a handful of policymakers being the one that will be picking the winners and losers in the market, you create there an incentive for larger corporations to influence these policymakers that are not saints normally, right? So I don't know. I mean, what I see is that in markets that are less regulated, in the sense that it's not a handful of policymakers, the one that are choosing the winners and losers, the larger corporations find them more unattractive. You can see this in practice in the US. If you see the largest companies in the US, you hear the CEOs in the conference calls, they normally say they don't want to have anything to do with West Coast cannabis, like Colorado, Oregon, Washington states, because they know that it's very hard for them to compete there, where there's unlimited licenses and you don't have policymakers choosing winners and losers. So I mean, I agree in principle. I think that operationally it is complicated when you think that political power will be the one doing the right choices in terms of picking winners and losers.
It's a good question, though. Oh, it's a good point to raise, whether or not we're excluding specific industries or whatever. But the concept of limited licenses is an interesting one. Like in Australia, we don't have limited licenses for medicinal cannabis companies. But in other places, there is a discrete number of licenses that are made available, I guess, to facilitate with control and oversight. But that comes with various sort of drawbacks as well. Like when it comes to commercial licensing, I guess, which is a big topic to sort of open up all of a sudden. But are there any particular jurisdictions that you think have done it like quite well or better than others, or ones that we might be able to look at or emulate? Katja, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Not sure. I think obviously the kind of West Coast America commercial model does scare Europe quite a bit. I think especially from the kind of public health kind of protectionist approach. And I don't know how well a commercial model like that would go down in Europe. I think there's a lot of learning around kind of promotion and packaging of products that might not be, that might not go through. I think a point I'd make around Canada and the kind of promotion and packaging around products is that from the get-go, they were quite restrictive with marketing. And this, I think, prevented a lot of people from shifting away from the illicit market kind of immediately. So I think when it comes to how we implement these policies just from the get-go, there might want to be a consideration around having a more progressive approach to advertising and promotion at the beginning, and then tightening and reevaluating those restrictions once consumers have become accustomed to the legal market and there's been enough of a shift from from the illicit market to the legal one.
When you say progressive, what do you mean? A more relaxed approach or a more strict approach?
I'm suggesting having a more relaxed approach to advertising and promotion initially, and then tightening and reevaluating those restrictions once consumers have become accustomed to the market.
Well, this is good because we can actually have a proper disagreement on something. I completely disagree with that. I think it needs to be the other way around. And I agree with consumers having freedom to have different products, but I have a different view on freedoms. I'm all for personal freedoms and bodily autonomy and so on. I don't have that view for corporate marketing freedoms. I don't like the idea of branding and marketing of products, and I was also involved in the designing of the packaging stuff in Canada, and I think they've got it about right. I think you do need really strict marketing control. Cannabis sells itself. It doesn't need goofy marketing and advertising and lifestyle branding bullshit around it to sell itself. People want cannabis. They will buy it, and the products, if they're good products, they will sell. I'm really wary of marketing and branding and lifestyle advertising and stuff. And I think you should absolutely be the other way around. Once you've got a market established, I think, and it's proving non-problematic, then maybe you could relax certain things. But I don't want to the sort of billboards and the kind of advertising and sponsorship of music and sports events and things like that we see with alcohol and historically did see with tobacco. I'd really be very wary of that, certainly in its starting point.
Alfredo?
Again, I think in theory it sounds good. Then you need to look at it in practice. Even right now in Germany, a very strictly regulated medical only market, it is obviously not legal to advertise a narcotic prescription medicine, yet you have all sorts of social media influencers doing stuff, promoting certain brands or products, and it's impossible to control, right? So yeah, you can have like very strict regulations around advertisement and say, yeah, we don't want advertisement, we don't want billboards, we certainly don't want things that is aimed at kids, like billboards, for example, that could be seen by anyone. But then in practice, are you going to control every social media account? Because companies are going to try to find a way to do it anyways. And we can see that already in the very strictly limited and regulated medical market. In a recreational market, good luck with that. I mean, yeah, in theory, you can try to restrict it, but it's going to be a cat and mouse game. So be ready for that. And then in terms of...
I was going to say, on the other hand, though, couldn't you argue that that we might have seen even more egregious advertising in the German market now, were it not for the fact that regulations were strict on paper, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a way of looking at it. But what I am seeing is like today, in a very small, comparatively speaking, with a recreational market, a very small medical market and tightly regulated, of course, there's no advertisement for cannabis products. Yet you do have, you mentioned sports, Steve. You do have medical cannabis companies that are sponsoring sports in Germany, football, soccer. So, are you going to be able to control all of that in a recreational market? Well, I agree with the goal, the intention. I think it's a good intention, but then it's going to be a cat and mouse game. So be ready for that and for having a state bureaucracy ready to control that, because it's going to be tough. And then in terms of starting with, like Katya is proposing, starting with loose regulations and then tightening it, Steve, the other way around. Again, I don't think there's a perfect solution. It's in terms of what you prioritize. I do, however, tend to disagree with Steve that it's better to start with strict rules, because then it can be loosened easily. That's very hard. So once you start with strict rules, at least the empirical evidence that we have so far, it shows us that it's extremely difficult to then loosen those regulations. And Steve, you mentioned the case of Uruguay, where you now agree that it was done perhaps too tightly regulated. And I'm not criticizing that it was done the way that it was done, because it was 10 years ago. It was a completely different world, or different pressures. I'm not trying to blame Uruguay for doing it the way that it was done, but I am just simply seeing now that 10 years later, it's extremely difficult to loosen, to relax those regulations. And for example, allow something that is so obvious that it needs to be done, which is allow sales to tourists in Uruguay. So tourists go to Uruguay and get cannabis in the illicit market because there's no legal avenue for them to get it. And there's a consensus in Uruguay that, yeah, it needs to be allowed, yet it is so damn difficult to do it. Same with the THC limits. It took years.
It's definitely a mistake that Uruguay made, is that it was all very good and well intentioned at the start, but it's failed to evolve. And I've talked to the Uruguay policymakers about that. And in Malta, which is in some ways, there's some parallels there in that you've got a smallish country, but Malta's, because it's an island, but they are at least open to other ideas, and they've said, look, we're going to see how it goes. We're going to review it. We can revisit some of these things. I don't know. I guess the experience with alcohol and tobacco, that it's proved so difficult to rein in the tobacco industry once it's already established and entrenched. We have kind of succeeded. We have succeeded in that, but it took like 30 years. I just feel it makes more sense to do it the other way around. Sorry, Katya.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think with like advertising and promotion and stuff, I don't think it's like a 0 or 100. I don't think it's like we have to have everything in like plain gray boxes with Times New Roman format. font, or like massive billboards and massive sponsorships at like at sports stadiums. I feel like there is like a middle ground in there somewhere where, you know, companies can have interesting and cool promotion packaging on the products and advertising in, you know, very like restricted ways. I don't agree that we should have massive billboards like, here's where you can get your legal recreational cannabis. But I feel like there is, you know, a middle ground in there somewhere that's not.
I think Canada's too strict.
Sorry?
And there's
Do you think Canada is too strict?
Actually, I'm afraid that we really have run out of time to answer that.
Oh no! It's just
Apologies, everybody. But thank you so much for your time and the stimulating conversation. I wish we could go on and on and on. But sadly, the format limits us. But thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for joining us. For those who are listening at home, thanks Katya, Steve, and Alfredo. It's been great to have your insights, and thank you again for your time. Make sure you follow the Penington Institute social media channels to hear about the next webinar in this series, which will probably be happening around February next year. And if you have any feedback or comments on today's session, please feel free to get in touch. Contact details are on the website, and as are the recordings of the previous webinars in this series. So we've had a couple of questions come in about how to access those. If you go to the Penington Institute website, that's pennington.org.au, and you click on News and Events at the top, and then down the left, there's a filter where you can select webinar, and that will show you all the webinars that we've run and have recordings for, including these webinars. So thank you again for your time. It's been fantastic. I look forward to speaking with all of you very soon, and enjoy your days or evenings.
Thanks very much.
Good job, Reese.